Hello and welcome to High Exam. And today we're going to be looking at carbon footprints, or another way of putting it, life cycle assessment. So when I walk down the street, I don't just see a series of people and a bunch of built infrastructure. I see these numbers over everybody's head that represent their individual impact. And then I see the impact of the things that they have recently purchased and the transportation that they're utilizing, as well as all the infrastructure that's around them. So there's multiple layers to this story of life cycle assessment. And if we look at it at a LCA of a wind turbine compared to a coal plant, you can see that we have the life cycle stages, so the upstream and then the operations and then the downstream. So this is the kind of disposal of the asset. If you look at wind, the vast majority of the impact, 86%, is from the actual building out of the turbine itself. And then if we look at a wind turbine, or excuse me, at a coal plant, it is 98% the actual operations of the plant, which are driven a lot by the combustion of coal itself. So if we look at the impact in terms of CO2 equivalents per kilowatt hour, we can see that wind is about 1% that of coal. So there is a sizable difference in the emissions, but it is also important to point out that there is some emissions from a wind turbine during its building, during its operation, as well as the disposal. And if we look at disposal, here's an example of some wind turbine blades that have been retired and they're being buried. This is also an issue with electric vehicles and what to do with all of the aging battery packs. The story is always more complicated. And to get an idea of life cycle assessment, there are lots of tools out there. There's things that are much more sophisticated than your typical carbon footprint calculator that uses basic variables like where you live, your diet, your miles traveled per year. These types of tools really break down how a given item, say you like to buy, a particular item repeatedly, what the whole supply chain looks like in terms of its environmental footprint. So just keep that in mind, that these tools are used to get accurate estimates of this impact, and performing those analyses can get fairly complicated. And here's another example of this story. We had Greta, the environmental activist. She sailed across the ocean on a zero carbon emission racing sailboat. And it should be pointed out that, yes, it is correct that while sailing across the ocean, no emissions came out of the boat itself. However, the boat has a bunch of embodied energy. There's fiberglass, aluminum, and nylon in these suits that were used to make this all possible. So keep that in mind, that there's different stages of operation, and the emissions don't just come while the particular item is being utilized. It's not that simple. Now let's take a look at a Tesla Model 3. A Tesla Model 3 is composed of about 10,000 parts. And if you were to walk to work and never buy a car, you wouldn't have these 10,000 parts built for you. If you do buy the car, there's somebody that's going to work to some degree for you. Some of the work they did was for your vehicle. There's crash tests and prototypes that were built on the account of having a Model 3. There's a large gigafactory and the associated lithium mines and other precious metals being mined in order to build the battery pack. And then there's the Tesla showroom where you buy your car. And the story even goes back further than that. To make the Model 3 possible, you needed to have a whole series of technology build outs. You needed the Model X, the SUV, and then the Model S. And then there was the Tesla Roadster. And the Tesla Roadster was based on the combination of a car called the T0 that was developed by AC Propulsion, an electric vehicle, as well as the Lotus Elise, a gasoline-powered vehicle, led to the original Tesla Roadster. Then if you go back even further, you start looking at things like the General Motors EV1, that was one of the very first mainstream electric vehicles during the 90s. And then if we go back to the end of the 1900s, you have the first electric vehicles ever built. And you go back even further and you have the grandmother that provided the cookies that inspired the build out of that first electric vehicle. And in order to get your Model 3 today, all of these steps had to occur. And if you start looking at the life cycle assessment, there is some connection between the product you buy today and all the research and development and iteration that occurred in the past. If you look at electric vehicles and charging them in different parts of the country, you get different environmental impact. If you're in California and you charge your vehicle, the grid is fairly clean. So lighter the color, the less the impact. And if you purchased a 4-cylinder subcompact car and you compared it at 0 miles, so basically while it's still at the lot, and you compared it to an EV, it would have less impact right out of the gate. That's because the electric vehicle has a significant amount of embodied energy because of the manufacturing associated with building out the battery pack. The cars themselves, the rest of the car, is pretty similar to the gasoline car, but then you add the battery pack, and it takes about 15,000 miles of driving the electric vehicle for the carbon debt to be paid back that is associated with the manufacturing of the battery pack versus the the gasoline powered car. Now we jump over to a dirty grid such as West Virginia, because they're in coal country. And the issue there is that an electric vehicle is actually dirtier than a 4-cylinder subcompact because the grid itself is so dirty that you never make up the embodied energy, and the day-to-day charging is fundamentally quite impactful. Then you can not only look at operating your electric car from a life cycle assessment standpoint within the different states of the US, but also throughout the world. If you're in India, charging your vehicle is going to be much more impactful than, say, the United States. And then if you're in, say, Paraguay or Iceland, it's going to be much less than the United States. So one of the things to keep in mind is that this isn't entirely your fault or completely under your control, that the infrastructure and the decisions of your part of the world that you live in will impact your carbon footprint. And you do have some control over your diet. You can be, a meat lover on one side, and on the other extreme, you can be a vegan, and you will reduce your impact. But the funny part is that vegans live forever, so their impact's going to be quite substantial, even though they don't eat that much that's impactful. They'll live forever. And now we jump over to looking at different countries. So if you're in the United States or one of these other red countries that have a significant carbon footprint, then you're likely to have a high carbon footprint as well. And there's a rule of thumb that for a given country, you're likely to only be able to roughly reduce your carbon footprint by 50% relative to the average within your region. So you don't have full control over the situation, but you can control that 50% or so by making environmentally wise decisions. And so looking at this life cycle assessment story, you can see it's a bit like a fractal. A fractal is one of these things that's created of individual elements that when you zoom in on them, it looks like that same element again. And that happens a little bit with the life cycle assessment process. As you zoom in, you need to do another life cycle assessment, and there's kind of these tendrils of accountability as you start to roll up what is the actual impact of the things that I purchased, the systems that I interact with. It's a very complicated dynamic, and these types of tools, these LCA tools, are helpful for getting your head around it. So again, when I walk down the street, I see all these numbers over people's heads, and I go, well, what if they were all vegan? It's definitely helpful, but at the end of the day, we don't have full control. We can control our individual decisions, but all this other infrastructure around us is not how the streets were built and how the military is run, and all those things are kind of government level decisions that we will need to both address our individual needs and make them low carbon, but also demand that those around us make similar low carbon decisions. Thank you for your time. This has been another episode of High Examine.